most of the time people want to be heard, and they want to know that someone internalized that, and then they are going to do something about it. And that doing something could be, yes, I'm going to make a change, or at least explaining to me, this is why I'm not going to do it. Either because there's other good reasons that I hopefully can be able to explain, or there's sort of other priorities, or that we can't put this on the front burner right now, and it needs to be something that we look at in the past. But I found that, while not fully satisfying, at least helps people realize something still happened with that. It was internalized, it was processed. It may not go the direction that I wanted, but at least I appreciate that there was a process that I could weigh in and at least get a chance to change the direction.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples, not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz, real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
I have this dream that I can go into other people's heads, kind of like that movie Being John Malkovich. Friends, family, customers, work colleagues, and to truly get that other perspective, truly know what those people think of me, my work, our company, our offerings, our products. Unless my life becomes a surrealist fantasy comedy, that is just not going to happen, right? But the closest thing I found is seeing every interaction I have with a customer, with a colleague, as a valuable thing to me, a thing of value that I must exchange my ego to receive. It's amazing what you can do, what you can learn if you just get that darn ego out of the way. So I loved reading this lesson in a recent podcast guest application. Feedback is a gift, and people are investing in you by providing candid feedback. Here to share the story behind that lesson, along with many more lesson-filled stories, is Brian Law, the Chief Marketing Officer at ZoomInfo. Thank you for joining us, Brian.
Daniel, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
So let's take a quick look at your background so people understand who I'm talking to. A long, illustrious, and varied background, starting as student body president while getting your MBA at Northwestern. As we'll hear, I think you've used some of those kind of political skills later in your career, maybe internationally.
Certainly tried to, yeah.
Organization effectiveness consultant at Willis Towers Watson, manager at Monitor Deloitte, principal of global business strategy at Google, vice president of global e-commerce and digital marketing at Rackspace, VP of data and analytics at HEB, senior vice president of marketing and general manager of e-commerce at Salesforce, which brings us to today. For the past year, you have been the CMO at ZoomInfo. ZoomInfo is a public company listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange. It recorded $1.07 billion in revenue in 2022. And at ZoomInfo, Law manages a team of 150 along with 100 different vendors and tech platforms. So Brian, give us a sense. What is your day like as CMO at ZoomInfo?
Yeah, and this is actually something I took from another CMO. I try and think of my world in four buckets. So one is people and sort of my team members who I'm interfacing with. The second one is marketing initiatives and obviously trying to push those forward. The third one is company priorities, and the fourth one is customers. And I actually try and divide, whether it's my day or not, my week equally across those different areas. And so what I found is many times marketers can be a little bit too focused and siloed just within their team, yet alone looking at the entire organization, yet alone really thinking about the customers. And so I try and do as much as I can and even split across those four different areas.
Okay, great. Now, let's take a look first at some of the lessons we can learn from the things you made in marketing. That's a great thing we do as marketers. I've never been an auditor, a podiatrist, or something else, but I do feel like we actually get to make things. Even in this digital economy, we make brands, we make campaigns. So let's look at some of the things lessons we can learn from there. Your first lesson was varied experiences inform a holistic approach to business problems. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, just from those things, you have a very varied experience from tech to grocery, to even having some little political background when you're getting your MBA. But this lesson, I think, kind of takes us internationally. So tell us an example of how you learned from your varied experiences.
Yeah, and so in addition to those, I've lived in a few different countries and actually worked in them. So I've lived in Brazil for a while, Mozambique, South Africa, Dubai in the UAE, India, and Australia. And what those holistically did, and then I'll talk about a specific example, is you're getting into a brand new culture. You don't understand sort of the inner workings, how people interact, what are their priorities, underlying beliefs. And this was true in many of those scenarios, but I'll talk about Dubai and the UAE. When you would actually first meet with people, many times before you could even get into business, when you were talking with an Emirati, you really had to get to know them as a person. It was an expectation. In fact, your first half hour may only be focused on that. And part of it, at least the way that I internalized it, was many times you were sort of feeling each other out to really understand sort of maybe what people's strengths were, but importantly, what people's weaknesses, or maybe a bit of information that could be used sometime down the road. If things didn't go the way you wanted, you could say, hey, Brian, remember you told me this? We need to make sure we're partnering a little bit better, because this could be a little embarrassing for you if I were to sort of mention that. But more broadly, what I think is it's a really interesting focus on, you need to get to know the people you're interfacing with, what they care about, what their motives are, who they are as a person before you get into business. And I think a really great example of how that came to fruition, when I was at Tableau, we were acquired by Salesforce. And obviously both wonderful companies, different cultures and different ways of doing things. But anytime you're doing an integration, there's a lot that has to be jammed together fairly quickly. And so in order for that to be successful, you really need to understand who your counterparts are. And so when I was sort of starting that process and getting to know people at Salesforce, I really needed to learn who they were as a person. What makes them tick? What is it about their family life, or sort of their career history, or just what their hopes, dreams, and wants are, that allow me to become much better partners with them, better read their sort of nonverbal cues, so that when we're in a meeting or a conversation that's potentially getting a little bit tough, I have something to fall back on to go back to that relationship and make sure that we can net out on the other end. And so I think that variety of international experiences, many of them wonderful, some of them not, helped me for those types of situations, such as the one when we were integrating with Salesforce.
Was there any specific tactic you used during the Salesforce integration? Or that maybe you learned from UAE or someplace overseas or otherwise? I know I've heard mergers and acquisitions called almost like dating in a sense. You know what I mean? It's like there's speed dating. There's different type of dating to see, like, are these two families going to come together? These cultures obviously don't want a Romeo and Juliet situation. So I wonder, was there any good thing? Just going to lunch with someone, buy them a drink, playing golf with them. what was something that worked well for you to get to know them?
Yeah, and it's an interesting comparison. Although certainly in an acquisition, that Tableau was very much being acquired by Salesforce, and so whether or not we wanted to be there, we were certainly part of it. Obviously, sort of great to become a part of the broader Salesforce family. But in terms of what I normally find, it's a really basic question, but asking people, like, what are the things they get most excited about inside and outside of work, and just sort of to hear what their passions are, normally draws out all sorts of things you would never learn about just saying, like, oh, tell me about your family, or tell me about what you're doing. But just like, if you could be doing anything, what would it be? Why is that? Why are you not doing more of it? And understanding that sort of passion component to people, I think is really, really valuable. So I try and do that at the beginning of any one-to-one when I first get to know someone, is really just sort of understand what makes them tick and what they're excited about.
And you bring up a good point. So maybe in dating, it's not you're the husband and wife that's going into marriage. Maybe it's more like the father-in-law, where you don't have a choice coming into this acquisition, but you better make sure you figure out what's going on the other side, right?
Yeah. But imagine many of us have gone through them. I've been both on the acquiring and acquired side, but they're never as smooth as you would like. But the thing that I found, there was actually a book that was written about it, that sort of the culture and the interpersonal component is one of the biggest determinants of whether it's successful or not. And so you really need to lean into that, both at the individual and the organizational level, to have success.
Absolutely. Let's talk about another lesson you learned. You say you can accelerate your career by identifying areas you are willing to take risks that others are not. So where was an area that you jumped in to take risks where others wouldn't?
Yeah, and I think about this from a career perspective, personal perspective, any individual negotiation. Like the more that you broaden the field of sort of decision-making points, the more success you can have. And so related to this, as I was thinking about my career advancement, something I really enjoyed being able to have maximum impact. I enjoyed being able to take on greater scope and responsibility. And I was trying to think, what would be some of the ways that I could do that a little bit more quickly? Obviously, working harder is a way to do that. But another one that I found fairly quickly is many times within your organization, you can find something that's really exciting, a great learning opportunity, but not something that everyone else is willing to do. And so one of those, I was actually based in Brazil at the time. There was an opportunity to go work in Mozambique for an extended period of time. Mozambique, a wonderful country. But for a long time, it's had it's been one of the poorer countries in the world, and it certainly has some hardships that are associated with it, in addition to the fact that there's a language requirement that not everyone speaks. And so it was a really, really wonderful opportunity in and of itself, but it was also a really great growth opportunity. I had a chance, being just out of business school, to be, sitting and working hand in hand with ministers of a country and leaders of multinational organizations that were coming and trying to enter that country and others. And it was because of the fact that I was willing to go to a place that not many people have spent a lot of time, was in Portuguese. And so I was learning Portuguese and really had to sort of focus on my efforts there. And there certainly were some components of it that were a little bit more challenging than, say, living at the time in Brazil or in the US or in other parts of the world, that were worthwhile sacrifices to make. But as a result, I got a world of riches in return, including sort of career development. And so that was just a way that I thought about that experience, and I've thought about other ones as well. And I think it served me well.
So I wondered if there's an analogy there for a brand, especially, working in a major brand that's a public company. Like we teach value proposition, the MECLABS methodology, one thing we teach is you have to find a level of exclusivity. And so sometimes to find that, you have to go somewhere where someone won't. However, you need to balance that risk in a smart way. And so one thing that we teach, at least with MECLABS as the parent organization, Marketing Sherpa, is experimentation, right? You take a small subset, you experiment, you see what works, and you double down there to go someplace somewhere else won't. So I wonder, I've definitely heard from startups, I heard from, I think, employee number 3 at BarkBox, which became 600 employees, public company. And they realized if they wanted that rapid growth as a startup, they had to take some big swings, and they made some daring risks. But what about, now you've worked in many more established public companies where you take a big risk. That is a big risk if the reward doesn't kick in. So how do you balance that, go where another brand won't, with doing what's right for the brand and the company?
Yeah, so it spurred a few ideas. So, and I'm going to be borrowing this actually from Peter Weinberg, who leads LinkedIn's B2B Institute, and he always talks about sort of 2 axes that you can make decisions. One is obviously if you're right versus not. The second one is, are you doing what everyone else is doing versus you're being contrarian? And obviously, if you're wrong, doesn't help. But if you're right in doing what everyone else is doing, it actually doesn't make that much of a difference. You need to be right in doing what no one else or few others are doing. So being that contrarian. And so it's actually an incredibly important way to think about going to market. So I think about a little bit less of like, are you willing to sort of sacrifice things that others aren't going to do? But like the only way you can actually get ahead is by actually being right and contrarian, which means you're going to have to take risks, and they need to be thoughtful risks. And I think the best way to be thoughtful in the risks that you're taking is really understanding who your customers are, what they care about, not just what they say, but truly what they value. And there's a lot of research. I love the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and the How Brands Grow book that they've written that provides some fodder for that. But going back to your original question, I think trying things out, being willing to take risks, do things differently, potentially put yourself in a bit of an uncomfortable situation in order to experience those sort of step changes in your performance are truly, truly critical. And you can't do that by just being safe. You're not ever going to get ahead by just being safe and doing what everyone else is doing.
I wonder if you have any experience in this or just have an opinion, if there's a difference if you're the market leader or if you're, kind of trying to go up against the market leader. Because, classic marketing textbooks, you'd have, Pepsi would do things Coke wouldn't. And, Avis, very funny with that. We're number 2, But lately I've seen more and more. I look at what a brand is doing. And, kind of when I ask them about it, we do these value proposition workshops where we get in a room with all the leaders and we kind of go through in 2 days. All right, how can we improve your value proposition? We look at what they're doing. It's like, this seems very similar to what your competitor's doing. And there seems to be now, with digital marketing growing, and so easy to just see all this data about what your competitors are doing, this kind of copycat approach. So I wonder if you've either been in that experience or just have an opinion on being the market leader versus being, trying to go up against that market leader, how that affects your approach to risk. And like you said, doing that thing that others won't do.
Yeah, and it's funny because I can answer both of those relative to my current role. Because so ZoomInfo, we've been always, I think, known in the sales space of having really, really strong data, and we've been the market leader there. We've been actively trying to grow in other areas, particularly in marketing and creating our own ABM platform. And so we have both the scenario of market leader, really well known, and trying to become sort of the upstart and be perceived. And I'd like to think that I use similar thinking across both of those. But when we talk to our senior leaders in the organization about what we're going to do, there's always a little bit more risk aversion when you are the market leader because you don't want to do anything to damage that credibility. But if you aren't always staying on top of sort of what customers want, you run the risk of losing your success. And so I think it goes back again to really understanding what your customers care about. I really like this idea of understanding when people are in buying situations, what are the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that go on for them, and then how do you attach your brand to those? And I think those are relevant whether or not you are at the top of your category or you're sort of an upstart trying to get space. And we actually did that research, and we found that us and many of our competitors aren't really doing a lot of messaging that aligns with how our customers think about the space, whether or not this was where we were sort of a top of the market or we're trying to grow. And I think being super thoughtful and maybe trying different ways to understand your customers allows you to have more clear, lower risk activities you can do to actually stand out and have growth. And I think the element that is potentially more riskier or more unique, at least in the B2B space, is doing what B2C has been doing for a really long time. And I don't know why it's taken us so long on the B2B side to learn some of those same lessons, understand, think about your customers in the same way. And so it's not so risky. It's just smart, and we don't do it as much on the B2B side.
Yeah, well, that's a great focus too. Like I said, so too often we're focused on our competitors, and focusing on the customer, that's the right place to be. Start there, and then obviously you want to do competitive analysis, but start with the customer, what they want, and then what they need. I like that. Let's talk about another lesson. Life is too short to be in an emotionally damaging work environment. So it sounds like this is one of those lessons where you learned in a very painful way, I'm guessing.
I definitely did. And in some ways it's tough looking back because I don't know that the leader fully appreciated the impact that they were having on me, but it was, I've always been an incredibly even-keeled, low-stress, calm individual, and the particular situation that they created was very sort of mentally and emotionally draining for me. It just became very, very taxing, challenging, was impacting sort of my personal life in addition to my work life. And I think like many of us, I was so committed to trying to see it out and just get to the outcome that I allowed it to have a lot of like personal and health impacts on me. And I probably let myself care too much about those situations as well. And so I think looking back, I ended up sort of leaving that situation and sort of moving somewhere else. But I put up with it way too long and let my personal pride get way too involved in sort of continuing and pushing through that scenario. When looking back now, it's been years, like there was no reason I needed to do that. I should have invested in myself, my own like emotional, mental well-being first. And found a sort of a better solution sort of to that situation. But I definitely know from talking to team members that I've had, friends that I've had, that's not an uncommon situation that we let ourselves just get stuck in this scenario where we feel like the only thing we can do is just sort of slog through the pain rather than actually figuring out how do I extricate myself from that situation. And there are different ways to do that. You could literally move yourself out of the situation or just find sort of a different approach, different dynamic with the people that are involved. And I wish I'd just been much more thoughtful and smarter about that sooner because it definitely was taxing for quite some time.
Hindsight's 2020, right?
Yeah, definitely true.
So you were just mentioning about how you try to have that focus on the customer, learn from the customer, put the customer first. What have you done now in your career as a leader to learn from your employees and make sure they're not in a similar situation as a manager? And I'll give you a specific example. I interviewed Justin Herber. He's the CMO and Chief Brand Officer of Tractor Beverage Company. I interviewed him on how I made it in marketing. And one of his lessons was don't be a dick, which is very direct. But he learned it from being in Hollywood, where he said, like, hey, we have this super cool job in Hollywood. Like, everyone wants to do this. And yet everyone's so stressed out. And the leaders here are just so abrasive and so rude. And he said, the way I'm going to manage, and what he's done in his career after he moved into marketing, he said, have high expectations and pursue the highest level of work without it turning you into a monster. So I just wonder, we just talked about customers, learning from them, being guided by them. Is there something you do to learn from your team, your employees, people who report to you, your vendors maybe, to make sure that you don't put them in a similar situation, to get the best from them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So maybe the way that I think about being a leader, I actually break it into three buckets. One is How do you achieve outcomes? The second one is around sort of stakeholder management. And the third one is the team component. And so really talking about those in the lens of the team, I always see my role as like, how do you create the North Star? How do you create the guardrails and space for people to be successful? But then how do you empower them as much as possible to get stuff done? I personally think I hate it when someone is staring over my shoulder. And so I try and create that same scenario for my team. But then specifically around how I try and create an environment that's working for them, I think it's really important to ask them. And it's one thing to ask for direct feedback, and some people provide it. Most people don't feel comfortable, probably either because they're scared or they've had reason to be scared that they're going to get blowback from any type of feedback they provide. And so I think creating anonymous ways to collect that feedback for myself, but also for our broader organization is something we try and do. I brought something into ZoomInfo that I've used in the past, but normally like at least every 6 months, trying to collect that feedback and very specifically on what I'm doing well, what I'm not doing well. Do they feel supported? Do they feel empowered? Do they have the tools and resources that they need? And just asking and then actually demonstrating that you're going to make improvements on those pieces of feedback is wildly important. There was a study that was done a few years ago, but it showed that if you ask for feedback and you do nothing about it, it's actually worse than never asking for feedback. And so I try and be very, very intentional, one, about hopefully showing that I know there are lots of things that I don't do well, then providing opportunities for people to provide that feedback, and then very, in a demonstrable way, showing that I am making changes based on it. And so I certainly would hope that no one would say Brian's a dick. But I do want to make sure that I'm setting up a place where people are excited to grow their careers, because at the end of the day, we spend so much of our time working. You need to make sure that you're setting up an environment where people want to come into work, they feel like they can have an impact, and they get excited about the work they're doing.
I looked at your LinkedIn before, so I did not see any LinkedIn recommendations that said Brian's a dick. So I think we're hopefully doing okay there.
That's good.
So I assume there's some times where you can't make changes, right? So do you follow up then and say, okay, hey, I hear you. I hear what you're saying, but here's some factors maybe you aren't aware of, or here's some reasons why we can't do that now. You just need to still make sure you close that loop when you can't act?
Yeah. So definitely. I mean, the thing just related to sort of communications and change management, I sometimes feel like we don't treat our team members as if they are the rational adults that they are. And most of the time, people want to be heard, and they want to know that someone internalized that, and then they are going to do something about it. And that doing something could be, yes, I'm going to make a change, or at least explaining to me, this is why I'm not going to do it. Either because there's other good reasons that I hopefully can be able to explain, or there's sort of other priorities, or that we can't put this on the front burner right now, and it needs to be something that we look at in the past. But I found that, while not fully satisfying, at least helps people realize something still happened with that. It was internalized, it was processed, may not go the direction that I wanted, but at least I appreciate that there was a process that I could weigh in and at least get a chance to change the direction.
Very nice. So as I mentioned, the first half of the podcast, we talk about lessons learned from the things you made. And the second half of the podcast, we're going to talk about lessons we learned from the people you collaborated with, because that's what we get to do in marketing. We get to make things, and we get to make them with people. But before we jump into that, I want to mention the How I Made It in Marketing podcast is underwritten by MECLABS Institute, the parent organization of Marketing Sherpa. To learn how MECLABS services can help you get better business results from deeper customer understanding, visit meclabs.com/results. That's MECLABS.com/results. Okay, your first lesson from the people you collaborated with, you said feedback is a gift and people are investing in you by providing candid feedback. I mentioned this in the opening. I love this lesson. You said you learned this from Taylor Rhodes, the CEO of Rackspace at the time, and now the CEO at Applied Systems. How did you learn this from Taylor?
So Taylor was a wonderful boss for a lot of reasons, but one of the things that I think he really helped me with is how to get more comfortable both in receiving and giving feedback. I think for many of us, the whole feedback process is unsettling. If you have to give good or bad feedback, you're worried about it, you're resistant to doing it, and you're always maybe a little concerned about the feedback that you're going to provide to others. And Taylor's framing was all about we all need to get better. You should always be incredibly appreciative to anyone who's providing feedback to you, because they're literally going out of their way to do something that they didn't need to do. It's much easier to say, "Hey, Brian, wonderful job. you're potentially just destroying a part of the business, or you're not a nice person. But it's much easier not to say anything. So if they're going out of their way to actually invest in you, you should treat it like that. You should actually make it come across as, thank you for that gift that you're providing me. This is what I'm going to do with it. And another thing that he mentioned that I thought was really true is any feedback is real. Because I think a lot of times we'll hear something and we'll say, oh, that's not true. They didn't understand this scenario, or they don't have full context. But the reality is, in their mind, it is 100% real. And so you need to treat it with that same level of respect as, something that was objectifiably an issue, and address it, even if it's just for them and their perceptions. And so I think, coming out of all of my experiences with Taylor, honestly, I felt much, much more comfortable on both sides of that equation. And in fact, even with my leaders 2 weeks ago, we were framing this up of, we all need to treat these as gifts that we're giving, both giving and receiving, because it's how we all get better, and people are investing in us, and we should be super appreciative about it.
So I love the idea. I love the philosophy. I feel the same way, but I want to battle test it for a second. I want to give you a very specific scenario and see how you handle it. So, in marketing, everyone in the organization has a marketing idea, right? They've all got a great idea for marketing. I interviewed, for example, Nicole Sala, the Chief Marketing Officer of Kitty Academy. And one of her lessons was, when there's a philosopher in the room, you need to diffuse idea grenades, because there's this whole idea, again, everyone's got a marketing idea. I used to work with a colleague. I loved it. He used to say, I bet the CEO never, took a shower in the morning and then came in and talked to the CTO, and he's like, hey, I've got some great coding ideas. Like, here's what we should do with our JavaScript or our Python or whatever, right? But everyone's got a marketing idea, from the receptionist to your mom to, the CEO to shareholders to analysts, everyone. So I agree with everything you said. I think that's a great approach to take. Specifically, how do you deal with all those marketing ideas that might not be the right fit, or again, like I like how Nicole Sala called it, those idea grenades.
Yeah, they come in. Well, yeah, and those certainly do. Certainly you always want to be open to ideas. One of the things, and it goes back to your customer comments earlier, I've found many times internally that whether it's the CEO or the head of sales, they all have some wonderful ideas, and you should figure out how to internalize those. But at the end of the day, it should be the customer that plays the sort of the deciding vote. And sort of a specific example I've now seen to be true at a couple of companies. We were thinking about the website, how you think about the website navigation. And everyone has a point of view on that. And we actually did this early on in both my tenures at these two companies, is we asked marketers, we asked salespeople, we asked senior executives how they thought about sort of the business, the products, and then we also asked prospects and customers. And it proved out to be true at both of those, which was sales and marketing were completely misaligned. And neither of them actually understood what the customer wanted. And so that actually became a framing mechanism after I learned the lesson at the first company, was to go to the second one and say, this is why we love your ideas, but we're always going to validate them with what the customers and the prospects think, because that is what we need to care about. And so I do think that their ideas are great. They help you think through what potential options might be, but you should never be subject to the whims of just what an internal person seems to think is the right thing. And I found that sort of objectivity to be really helpful to maybe reduce some of the pain associated with those, the wealth of ideas that can come through from different parts of the organization.
The wealth of ideas. That's a nicer way to put it than idea grenade. The wealth of ideas. Let the customer decide. I like that. Your next lesson, you said, we can all give way more of ourselves than we believe possible. You learned this from Gera Freitas, the founder and chairman of Share Circle, a nonprofit dedicated to increase access to quality higher education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for Angolans, and also at Angola University. So how did you learn this from Gera?
Yeah, and Gea has someone who I got to know when I was at Kellogg. So he grew up in Angola. For those who don't know, Angola had a very protracted civil war. He actually had to leave his family at a very early age, just given some of the risks associated with that war. So he really educated himself and actually got to the United States through some Americans who funded him to come out to the U.S. and then set up a nonprofit fully focused in Angola. And he gave almost every cent of that to the Angolans, including living with his family in someone's basement, as a way to just make sure that he could really give everything that he could. So there were two things I learned from him. One was the one that you mentioned. The other one is he always said you should have multiple options. You should always have a plan A, B, C, and D, because for him, practically in life, the options or door A and B normally weren't open. They had been closed, and you had to figure out how to get C and D. But it actually allowed, I think, a different viewpoint on the world. Because if you're expecting to need 4 options or 3 options for everything that you do, you don't get so hung up on the first one not working. And so you become a lot more comfortable about, hey, that one didn't work, but we already have a second one. Or, man, I spent all this time on this one getting through, and I've had sort of my boss, nix it at the very end. I could be very disappointed, but, I already have plan B, so I can work through that one. And so I think it was the combination of his sort of optionality sort of drive, and then just seeing how much he was willing to do for others and the sacrifices he was willing to make for others, and the education of kids in Angola and really people who are in a really tougher situation has been sort of wildly impactful. I don't know that Geha fully appreciates the amount of impact he's had on me, but it definitely impacts my approach towards optionality. And anytime something's tough, I think about some of the stories he's told me and the challenges that he's had to go through. And practically, you're normally not dealing with anything that's all that hard in business in the grand scheme of things, relative to being in a civil war and trying to just have your family survive.
That's some great perspective to have, yeah. But when you from this lesson, it got me thinking. This is very true at a personal level. The idea of we can all give way more of ourselves than we believe possible. But what about on a brand level? Like, I found that a lot of brands, we're just kind of we keep the values so tight to our vest, so to speak. Like we're so tight in what we are willing to give our customers. I'll give you an example. Flint McLaughlin and I were interviewed. He's the CEO of Mech Labs. We were interviewed by Catherine Hayes of Wharton on her Sirius XM show, and he had this little bit that I really liked. He said, "I think it's possible for a business to individualize subscriptions at a level we've never seen before and serve people with a far more powerful piece of content than has happened in our history. But instead, we're using data to create more targeted advertising campaigns and interrupt their life." And I like that example because now with AI coming up, artificial intelligence, with personalization, it seems like we often use it more to get more out of the customer than to give them more than we thought possible. So I wondered your perspective on that as a brand leader.
Yeah, it's a really good call out. And I mean, it ties, again, a little bit into what we were talking about before. I try and I encourage my team members to always put the customer at the forefront of what you're doing. Just at a macro level, you should be trying to get perspective from them. But I think at the end of the day, and sort of Adam Selipsky, who's now the CEO of AWS, was the CEO of Tableau when I was there. And he would always say this: at the end of the day, if you put the customer first, you will solve most revenue and efficiency problems. Not always the case, but most times that's true. And I think you need to think that at the macro level, but down to the individual. Like, why are you doing these individual things? How do you improve the experience so that it works best for the customer? Even like on the website, if you're having a CTA, does it speak to exactly what it is they're wanting? When you're developing a community program, are you actually trying to solve for the customer's community desires, or are you trying to solve for an internal efficiency desire? And so I think all of that, the framing around what you do needs to be customer first, and you can get in a better spot. And then a little bit tied into the specific example you provided, we have so much data on our customers. Certainly we do, because ZoomInfo has a massive amount of data, but all of us have a ton of data around our customers. And if you can leverage that in a way that actually makes the experience better for them, one, that they'll be more likely to sort of engage and want to engage with your brand going forward. But it also increases the likelihood that they're going to want to buy more products from you, or be a customer longer, or expand their engagement. And so I think trying to be relevant down to the micro level with your customers as much as possible ends up being a win-win for all of us.
What about artificial intelligence? So I've asked, all the different guests that have come on here, and we're all at a different level in terms of maturity, in terms of experimentation, in terms of what we're kind of ready to open up the kimono and talk about. I wonder, I think that's maybe a great example of what you just talked about, of putting the customer first, where we see some brands are using artificial intelligence, either just straight cost savings, or to see, for lack of a better word, can we trick customers into thinking this is human interaction? Versus there are some brands that are starting to play with it and saying, how can we create a better experience for customers? So I wonder, have ZoomInfo, have you dipped your toe into this AI water yet, this artificial intelligence water? Have you played with anything? Have you tried to put the customer first with that?
Yeah, well,
it's early days. I understand it's very
a broad
early
question.
days.
So a few things. So obviously, I think all of us are aware of OpenAI and ChatGPT and sort of the capabilities there. We actively leverage that in our marketing efforts to try and personalize what we're putting out there. Within our product, and we actually released a video showing some of our plans on that front of actually being able to leverage that technology to help it for us, our sellers and marketers, actually start the day and say, hey, what should I focus on first? And it's actually provides more guided steps of you should do this, and then if you want to do this, we can help you complete that activity. And so I think the potential is huge. I think right now there's a little bit of overselling in terms of what companies are doing relative to what they've actually figured out, which is fine. But I think the potential is really, really exciting, particularly where it allows all of us to spend more time on the value-added activities we want to be doing and less time on just sort of the menial, busy tasks. And I think if we can all be doing that for our customers, allow them to focus on the things they want to be doing and the things where they can add more value, it'll make them more successful. It'll make them want to use our products more. So I think the potential is huge. I think we're still all trying to figure out exactly how to tap into that potential, though.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Let's talk about another lesson. You said, make sure the people you work with know that you care about them. You learned this from Jackie Yaney, the former CMO of Tableau.
Yeah, and Jackie's wonderful. So I think something she potentially more than anyone else that I can think of really invests in the members of her team and understands them as individuals first. And I think it's something she said when she first joined Tableau. And I've noticed sort of throughout the time getting to know each other, and even since she's retired, it's just really incredibly true. In the way in which she prioritizes individuals allows you to have a better relationship for her with being my boss. But sort of it creates a culture across the organization of we are looking out for each other first as people, before as sort of, a colleague who is trying to deliver something. And it just, it develops a stronger team bond. It allows for sort of more open communication. It facilitates, individuals finding opportunities, which many times ends up being better for the organization. So if I feel comfortable enough to be candid with Jackie about my hopes and dreams, she can help me actually achieve those, which many times is better for sort of the organization as a whole. And so I definitely have internalized that. I've tried to make sure that each of my team members know that that's how I perceive them. It makes, in addition to all of those benefits, it makes just work a more enjoyable place to be when you know that sort of your boss or your colleagues ultimately care about you as a person first. And about someone who is working for the company second. Jackie's a superstar at that approach.
Is there any specific tactic that works really well for you in actually achieving that, one-on-ones, everyone does something different? I know I interviewed Gene Hopkins, the chief revenue officer of OneScreen.ai on How I Made It Marketing. And one of her lessons was allow your team to shine. And the way she did that was she was always looking for what is their next step, even if it's, what is their next role, even if it doesn't fit in with what their current role is. And she mentioned the QA lead, quality assurance lead. She saw something in that person from interacting with them and made them the co-host of a podcast, which is not something that you would usually expect from, a QA lead. So I wonder for you, as a tip to other managers out there, other leaders, is there a specific tactic that's really helped you be able to do this?
Yeah, so I think a few different things. So one, a lot of companies do this, but at the beginning of the year, you do like an individual development plan and you just ask them more broadly, like what are the things they're wanting to achieve outside of this role over the next 3 to 5 years? It gives you a lot of opportunity to help figure those pieces out. Something that it's going to sound like a silly thing. It's not that often that people ask you how you like to be recognized. And I've learned that people really, really care differently about the world. And so being able to actually then execute on those tends to be really impactful. One, because you haven't really been asked before, but you may not expect people to follow through. And so this was actually something I did back starting at Rackspace, is we collected for everyone on the team, like what were the things they liked from a recognition perspective. And then when that person did a good job, I would go back to my file and be like, Sally, this is, and I would then try and actually deliver on that. And I think it's a lot of those like micro sort of elements, or, you had the initial conversation and you wrote down the names of their team members or sort of their family members and sort of like what they do outside, and you follow back up on that. Or, you start a conversation with them and you always ask like, how is their broader life going before you get into work pieces? But those little signs that you're paying attention and that you value them as an individual, I think can be really impactful.
I haven't heard that one before, like how people want to be recognized, because that's a really good point. There's such a a mix between introverts and extroverts. And a lot of times we think other people are like us, but really they might not like some big public recognition, like, the next all hands meeting, even though we might. They might just like some, quiet note or letter. I really like that one. That's a nice tip.
In fact, on that one of my direct reports, the thing that she wanted more than anything else was a handwritten note. And it was just interesting because that wouldn't have been what a lot of people would have said. But it's harder to give people what they want if you don't ask.
Well, I think that kind of really sums up the thing we've been talking about. Like where you've talked about learning about the customer, letting them drive the decisions, put the customer first, not your competitors, not technology, learning about your employees is, I've always heard this thing. We shouldn't treat other people how we want to be treated. There's that maxim, we should treat other people how they want to be treated. And that is the biggest challenge, to like reach outside of our own brain and like to actually, learn how that person wants to be treated. So kudos to you. I really like that, like asking the type of recognition they want.
Yeah, it's I can't take full credit for that one. It was actually someone else who had that idea, but I've definitely borrowed it and seen the upside from it.
Well, we've talked about a lot of different things about what it means to be a marketer. Lessons you learned all the way from Dubai and Mozambique to as close to home as Salesforce and Tableau. So if you had to break it down, when you're hiring or just for yourself, what do you think? What are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
And some hopefully they'll align with things we've talked about. So I think first and foremost, how are they thinking about the customer first is really, really key. Secondly, are they demonstrating that they're inquisitive and they're a learner? Inevitably, we don't understand everything that's going on within our space, but there's also so much newness that's coming through. How do they try and get up to speed? How are they trying to stay on top of trends? But also just how do they approach others? Are they sort of a term, a knower versus a learner? Are they coming in and saying, this is how it's going to be because of X, Y, and Z? Or, hey, help me understand. Why did we do this? So can you give me some context and perspective? I think is really key and something I try and understand. Certainly from a leader, I want someone who's going to provide direction, but ultimately really empower their teams. That's the way you scale. And so I think that's really, really incredible as well. And then I'm a big believer, and you alluded to this earlier, this idea of iterative improvement. You need to be figuring out like directionally where you want to go, but how do you stair-step your way and do it quickly? And certainly something I will say, a lot of companies move fast. ZoomInfo moves faster than any company I've ever worked for. And so that iterative approach is incredibly quick. We really want to see what can we learn? How do we internalize that? How do we then build on it in the next step? And I found each of those to be really key. And then the last one, and it ties into the inquisitive component. I really think it's important to have people who are strong performers, but are also going to be sort of good from a behavioral perspective. And a big piece of that for me is someone who is looking to give credit to the team. They're humble. They want to be a part of a broader whole and see the success of the group rather than looking out for their own success and potentially having really sharp elbows. And so that's something that I've found to be really successful, whether that's marketing or when I was in strategy before. But that team focused approach I think is key.
So we're looking for some smooth elbows, some nice smooth. Yes, no, I totally agree. Thanks so much, Brian. I learned a lot from you in this conversation, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, Daniel, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
And thanks to everyone for listening.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.